Hubert Darrell is the greatest explorer of all time that no one's ever heard of. Other explorers that everyone has heard of, for example, the Norwegian great Amundsen, the first man to the South Pole, first person to sail through the Northwest Passage successfully. Amundsen actually met Darrell in the Arctic and was almost rendered speechless. He was in awe of Hubert Darrell, and he wrote, Amundsen did in his own autobiography, that with men like Darrell, I could go to the moon.
That is Adam Shoalts, RCGS Explorer-in-Residence, author and old friend of this podcast. He's our guest on this episode of Explore, a Canadian Geographic podcast, talking about his latest book, Vanished Beyond the Map, The Mystery of Lost Explorer Hubert Darrell. Welcome to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. I'm your host, David McGuffin. If Adam Shoalts has a white whale, it is definitely the lost explorer Hubert Darrell and the mystery behind his disappearance in the Western Arctic over 100 years ago. In fact, Hubert Darrell came up when I first interviewed Adam on this podcast back in 2019. Who's a Canadian explorer no one knows about but should?
Oh, that's a good question. There's one who he's my unsung hero. His name is Hubert Darrell.
And that was already 8 years after Adam began digging into Darrell's story. So it's safe to say that this book has been a passion project, and that comes through in the very best of ways. Vanished Beyond the Map is a rollicking adventure story, an explorer whodunit, and a captivating tale about the last days of the golden age of exploration before airplanes and telecommunications made the world a much smaller place. And before we get to Adam, after the interview, stick around for a modern adventure tale. I've mentioned before on this podcast my two nephews, Keenan and Callum McGuffin, and their efforts to sail around the world in a 30-foot sailboat. 3 years after leaving Salt Spring Island, they are in the home stretch and potentially the most challenging one, the Northwest Passage. I reached them for a short and fascinating conversation about their adventures in the Arctic Ocean and beyond. But first, on to Adam Shoalts and the lost explorer, Hubert Darrell. Adam Shoalts, welcome back to the Explore podcast.
It's a pleasure and an honor. Always happy to come on the Explore podcast.
It's so great to have you back. I've finished your book, read it in a blazing couple days, really enjoyed it. So Hubert Darrell, who's the focus of this book, I did a quick search, just even in the podcast search engine, and the only place it comes up is you and I talked about him in 2019 in your very first interview on this podcast. Because I think at that point you were actively on the hunt for him still. So this has been going on for a while, but I guess for those who didn't hear that or forgot that episode, can you tell us about Hubert Darrell and what it is that linked you to this guy?
Yeah, absolutely. Hubert Darrell is the greatest explorer of all time that no one's ever heard of. He's a legendary figure from the past, but not one in a million has ever heard of him today. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. That's how obscure he is. He's never had a book written about him until now. That's why what was motivated to write the book, Vanished Beyond the Map, The Mystery of Lost Explorer Hubert Darrell. He's an explorer who vanished back in the year 1910. But the amazing thing about him is, even though today almost no one has ever heard of him, in his own time, he was very much a living legend. And other explorers that everyone has heard of, for example, the Norwegian great Amundsen, the first man to the South Pole, first person to sail through the Northwest Passage successfully. Amundsen actually met Darrell in the Arctic and was almost rendered speechless. He was in awe of Hubert Darrell, and he wrote, Amundsen did in his own autobiography, that with men like Darrell, I could go to the moon. And he went further in his autobiography. He said Darrell was one of the finest men of the northern breed it's ever been my good fortune to meet. And he called him the hardiest, the greatest explorer of the polar regions, and yet Amundsen said almost no one knows who he is. And Amundsen said if fate had not intervened, because Darrell vanishes almost without a trace in 1910, Amundsen said in his own autobiography, I wanted Darrell to be a part of the elite group of handpicked men to go with me to the South Pole. And he said undoubtedly he would have been in that party, which would have been fascinating because here would have been the only non-Norwegian member of that party to reach the South Pole. And Amundsen was by no means alone in this assessment of Darrell. Pretty much everyone from all different backgrounds who crossed paths with this guy came away impressed. We're talking Indigenous chiefs, fur traders, hardened whaling captains who would overwinter in the Arctic ice. Anyone who encountered Hubert Darrell saw him as a man of mystery, a man of almost superhuman abilities who was famed for being able to walk, never mind dog sled. In an era when travel by dog sled or canoe was the norm, Darrell became legendary for wandering for thousands of kilometers on foot, alone across the Arctic, from Alaska to Hudson's Bay, north onto the frozen Arctic Ocean, and south into the boreal forests. And everyone, Stefansson, another very famous Canadian explorer, he was the official leader of the Canadian Arctic expeditions. He wrote in his own book, after Darrell's disappearance, that almost no one has ever heard of Darrell, but the truth is he was far more accomplished and far better as an explorer than many others who are far more famous. And that assessment came up over and over again. And when he disappeared, it did make headlines. I saw headlines about Darrell in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, but in the years afterwards, he was forgotten and he disappeared from history almost as surely as he did in the wilderness. I had stumbled upon him back in 2011. I was just, as one often does on a Friday night, reading through historical records, and I kept coming up to references to Hubert Darrell like a will-o'-the-wisp in the past. I'm like, who is this guy who's been forgotten? And I had to learn more about him. So I went down many rabbit holes. And over the years, I kept, overturning more stones, digging up letters that Darrell had written to family members which had survived. I eventually got my hands on his journals, his surviving journals, which were kept in his he had mailed them to his sister in England, and they had held on to them for almost half a century. And then in the 1950s, had donated them to an archive in England, and they basically sat there collecting dust for generations until I came along and said, I can't get enough of this fascinating mystery. I need to piece it together, whatever clues have survived. I want to retrace his roots to the wilderness, look for his old cabins, track down any black and white photographs of him, anything I can find to piece together the story of his life and his disappearance. And that's what I ended up doing. That's the book about his life and my quest to basically tell his story.
So give us the origin story. Like, where's he coming from and how does he wind up in the Canadian Arctic? And this is the early 1900s.
Yeah, that was a mystery. I mean, even when I started researching him, no one was really sure when he was born, but I found his baptism record. It turned out he was born in England in 1874, late Victorian era, late 19th century. And he came from a modest family. He was not from a wealthy background by any means. He grew up in rural England, in the countryside there, but he came to Canada while he was still a youth. He was only 16 years old when he had to basically leave the family home and seek his own fortune in the world because he had to find a way to make a living. And both he and his brother actually ended up immigrating to Manitoba. And they worked on a farm in Manitoba in the 1890s. And this kind of was the coming of age of Hubert Darrell. He got inured to hardships and hard work. He learned the ropes working on a remote farm about 3 hours northwest of Winnipeg, out in a little place called Birtle, a very isolated place. He hunted, he trapped there. And he did that for about 7, 8 years until 1898 or so, when the Klondike Gold Rush erupted. And then, like thousands of others, he got swept up in the Klondike Gold Rush. He headed north to seek his fortune, hoping that he'd strike it rich in the wilderness of the Klondike and be able to pay off the farm's debts. He never found riches, always eluded him, but it was in the north, in the Yukon, that he discovered his true calling, which was map making and exploration, trades that he absolutely excelled at. And over the course of the rest of his life, he would never really leave the north. He would become a legend wandering all over it, a jack of all trades. He was hired as a guide for far more famous explorers. Many people sought him out and said, your reputation precedes you, where you can't go anywhere across the north to a fur trading post or an outpost and not hear about this legendary solo wanderer, the mystery, the eccentric Darrell. And people would try to hire him. But he eventually ended up getting hired by the Hudson's Bay Company as a mail carrier, a job that he excelled at, carrying the mail between widely separated Arctic outposts alone in the dead of winter. And he continued to prospect, looking for gold in isolated mountain streams. But really, his real love was simply the allure of the wild, of the unknown, exploration. And that's what he did and continued to do right up until 1910 when he vanished. And what actually happened to him was one of the mysteries I was trying to solve. And that involved a lot of archival research, tracking down leads, interviewing elderly people who by chance might have known, not him, because even if you're very elderly, you're not likely to have known someone who was alive in 1910, but I figured you might know someone who knew him. And I did a lot of that for years. As you alluded to, you were at my place 6 years ago, and I was telling you about Hubert Darrell, the Lost Explorer, I'm researching.
Yeah.
And it's taken another 6 years before I finally finished my research and finished my book on him. So it's been a long time coming, but I really didn't want to necessarily rush the process. I did multiple expeditions in the Arctic looking for his old cabin ruins, retracing his routes. He covered a lot of ground, thousands of kilometers.
Yeah.
That's why it's taken me years to retrace his routes and tell his
Yeah.
story as best as I could, because I wanted to go, where did he paddle? Where did he break trail? Where did he snowshoe over the mountains? I need to go to those places to describe as accurately as I can his experiences, because ultimately I'm trying to bring him out of the shadows and tell his extraordinary story. One of the most extraordinary things about him I haven't even mentioned yet, which is he was credited with saving the lives of hundreds of whalers, American whalers, who were imprisoned, trapped in the ice of the Beaufort Sea, no way out. They were running low on supplies. In those days, they didn't have the luxury that we do of telecommunications, satellite communications, so they were completely cut off from the world. And this one lone wanderer crosses the ice of the Beaufort Sea to the whaling ships and says, I'm going to bring word of your plight to the outside world so we can organize relief ships to sail up here and essentially rescue you. And that individual was Hubert Darrell. He sets off for like over 1,000 kilometers alone in the dead of winter from the Beaufort Sea over the mountains to try to get to the
On
nearest.
foot.
Yeah,
This is
on
like
foot.
on foot. This is not
No
dog
dog
sled.
sleds.
This is,
And it's
yeah.
like, why doesn't he have dog sleds? And as Hubert Darrell himself explains in one of his letters, some of his letters were hard to read. They're over a century old. You can imagine they were jotted down under difficult, adverse conditions, but I'd look at them with a magnifying glass. Anyways, there's no trails to follow, and the snows in the mountains are too deep for dogs. Dogs will be played out quickly if they try to get through that deep snow. It's almost engulfing a husky. And of course, he has to travel light, so he can't bring extra food for the dogs. So he travels on foot, and he does it, and he goes all the way south into Alaska to a little place called Eagle, to the nearest telegraph station, so that word can be relayed to the outside world about these whalers. And everyone who was in the North at the time was like blown away by what he did and said he saved the lives of all these hundreds of whalers. And he didn't even take credit for it. He just disappeared again afterwards and wandered off into the wilderness. And people were like, the newspapers around the world carried the story of the plight of these whalers, but they never even mentioned by name Hubert Darrell and the part he played in all of this. He just went anonymously over the hills and just took back to his solitary wandering, right?
But this was his connection, though, to Roald Amundsen. This is where, because you have a description of Roald Amundsen coming across him on this mail route at one point and just being shocked,
Right.
like one of the most hardened explorers in the world, and just being blown away by what this guy was doing on his own.
It just happened to be the same winter that Amundsen was completing his crossing, his first ever historic crossing of the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific, a journey that ended up taking him a couple of years with his small Norwegian crew. And his own small ship was trapped in the ice of the Beaufort Sea. They were frozen in. But Amundsen, with a couple of others, had undertaken what he had perceived as a huge journey from his frozen ship to go south into Alaska to the nearest outpost of civilization. And while doing this journey, he's blown away that he comes across this lone wanderer who, as Amundsen says, is like basically acting as if he's out for a Sunday stroll, like the most casual thing in the world. And Amundsen's like, I was astounded by this guy. And he ends up saying, I invite you to come to my ship in the frozen sea whenever you get a chance, when you're not too busy. Amundsen, of course, says, I never expected to ever see him again. But just a few months later, as if a phantom materializing out of the Arctic mist, comes this lone figure walking across the frozen Arctic Ocean to this frozen ship in the ice. And Amundsen can't believe it. It's Hubert Darrell. He's come as if casually, like another 900 kilometers to his ship. And Amundsen's just blown away. He's like, I entertained him for a few days, gifted him a pair of Norwegian snow goggles, and then he's on his way again, just wandering across the ice. So it's an extraordinary story, and it's one that I thought, it's amazing this hasn't been told. I need to put this all together and write a book to hopefully make this incredible adventure story, this epic survival story, bring it to modern attention.
There's a lot of great characters woven through this story and people he's connected with. And there's one of his great benefactors was this guy named Hanbury, who he worked with on a pretty epic cross-Arctic expedition. And so can you just tell us a bit about that and where that fits into Darrell's story?
Yeah, so Darrell had many adventures. He disappeared. When he disappeared, he wasn't old. He was only about 36 years old when he vanished. But in that relatively brief time, he lived through so many adventures and expeditions that it would fill several lifetimes. And he crossed paths with almost every big character in the era of the Klondike Gold Rush and in exploration in the polar regions. This is the era of Shackleton and Scott and Amundsen, of course. But one of those famous explorers he was involved with was David Hanbury. And Hanbury was a British aristocrat who came to Canada around the year 1899, looking to do what he claimed was a journey for sport than travel. But in reality, there was much more to Hanbury than met the eye. He was a trained scientist. He was a sort of polymath. He was very good with languages. He could speak several indigenous languages. And he had a very unconventional approach to exploration at that time. For example, one of Hanbury's at the time perceived as eccentricities is that he didn't believe in the custom of naming anything. He believed in the recording of indigenous names for all places. And Hanbury also believed in traveling in very small groups. He was the opposite of many of the famous British explorers who thought there was strength in numbers, bring 100 men onto the Arctic ice kind of thing. Hanbury didn't want to travel in a group of more than 3 or 4, and he would travel with the Inuit when he was in the Arctic. But he was in the Northwest Territories when he happened to cross paths with, at a fur trading post, this young fur trapper. And that young fur trapper just so happened to be Hubert Darrell. And Hanbury, he was generally a pretty shrewd judge of character, and he almost immediately perceived that there's something about Darrell that's a little out of the ordinary. This is the kind of guy that I would want in my canoe with me or when I'm wandering across the Arctic. So he immediately offers Darrell a job. He says, I'll hire you to be my assistant. Come with me on this expedition. And Darrell, of course, says, sure. And they spend almost the next year and a half living in the Arctic, wandering across the Arctic, covering literally thousands of miles. They range over an immense area from Great Slave Lake east to Hudson's Bay, north to the Northwest Passage. They travel along the frozen Northwest Passage, and then they eventually come back south again up the Mackenzie River. And Hanbury did write an account of his travels. He was a member of the Royal Geographical Society. He's never really one to wax poetic. And he doesn't say a whole lot about Darrell other than making it plain that Darrell was like a man of few words, but someone who was extremely competent and very effective in the role that he played. And yeah, I mean, it's just one of these many stories in Darrell's life where he's basically on the margins of making history, but he never really comes out of the shadows himself. And he's, just a fascinating character who's swept up in countless adventures and journeys, almost beyond imagining some of them.
What they shared in common was that the connection with indigenous culture and realizing that if you're going to survive in this harsh an environment, minus 50 degrees and brutal storms and everything else, you need to adapt the practices of the people who've lived up there for hundreds and thousands of years or whatever it is. When do you see Darrell making that connection? Like, when does that switch happen where he's like, oh, indigenous people have a lot to offer us in terms of survival up here?
Yeah, so he's a teenager on a farm in Manitoba. And you can imagine what farming in Manitoba in a place like Birtle would have been like in the 1890s. It's not for the faint of heart. It's hard labor. And at that time, many of those farms were struggling to make ends meet. So he had been doing this since he was basically 16 years old. He had a pretty hard scrabble upbringing, and he's working hard on a farm trying to put food on the table. And then he goes to the Klondike Gold Rush, which again attracted thousands of people from diverse backgrounds, from everywhere from New York City to farms in the Midwest. And when he goes north in the Klondike Gold Rush, he exhibits what he'll become famous for, being a bit of a lone wolf. In the beginning, his first winter in the Klondike, he partners up, as was the norm at the time, with another prospector, an older American guy. But Darrell just says this guy doesn't know the dinner knife from his jackknife. The guy doesn't know how to do anything. So he makes up his mind that he's going to go off on his own and become a solitary wanderer, which is what he does. He shuns a lot of company, and he wanders all the way from the Yukon into the Northwest Territories. And it's around Great Slave Lake that he meets up with the local Indigenous Dene people. And he becomes a kindred spirit. He gets invited to live with Chief Yinto and his brother. And apparently Yinto, who's the chief of the local Indigenous Dene, sees something in Darrell that he doesn't see in others, because Darrell ends up learning the language, Athabascan. He actually will, over the course of his relatively brief life before he disappears, learn to speak at least 2 different indigenous languages. And he makes strides in a third. And he says, Darrell, come live with us, come travel with us, come onto the Arctic tundra and hunt muskox and caribou. And Darrell does this, and he's the only outsider in this small band. And it's really, from a historical perspective, it's fascinating because this is the end of an era. All around them, everyone, the Dene, the fur trappers, they can see that it's an end of an era. It's an era of tremendous technological invention and upheaval. This is the era of the Paris World Fair, the Eiffel Tower, Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla. So inventions are changing everything. And that era of traditional lifestyles, hunting and gathering and trapping, is rapidly coming to an end at the dawn of the 20th century with the Wright brothers and everything else. But Darrell is like maybe the only outsider to really witness what it's like to hunt among the Dene on the tundra before technology has forever changed that, right? Before you get all of these modern contraptions and just enormous pressure and more mining and opening up the north and basically changing the culture. And he experienced it firsthand as he's a young outsider, and it changes him forever, not only physically, but his philosophical outlook, which I get into in the book a little bit. He becomes a huge advocate of maintaining Indigenous cultures. He's very hostile to missionaries at a time when that opinion was by no means the norm in Canada. In fact, he kind of makes a lot of enemies. Pretty much everyone, all the power brokers in Canadian society, he takes a strong dislike to. He's actually quite hostile to the Hudson's Bay Company. He doesn't agree with their trade practices. He doesn't like missionaries changing Indigenous cultures. He doesn't like the Canadian Pacific Railway because of his farming background. And he also doesn't have a very favorable view of the Canadian government. He describes it in extremely hostile terms as corrupt and all these bad things. So it all contributes to his sort of legendary but eccentric persona as this lone wolf, mysterious figure. But there's no denying among everyone who meets with him, again, from all different cultural backgrounds, whether it's the Inuit, the Dene, French-Canadian fur trappers, Americans, they all think he's blessed with extraordinary abilities. One thing that comes up over and over again is that he had physical stamina, like, some sort of Olympic gold medalist. The guy could just walk for endless miles without tiring in the dead of winter with no trails to follow, breaking trails. And eventually his skills are such that the Mounties, at the time the Northwest Mounted Police, they seek him out and say, we want to hire you as a special constable with the job of leading our sled dog patrols. And to lead a sled dog patrol takes a little bit of an explanation. It's about the most backbreaking work imaginable. The leader of the sled dog patrol doesn't get to ride on a sled or use dogs themselves. They actually have to travel on foot to break the trail for the dogs, for the huskies to follow, because they can't get through the deep snow on their own. And they say, Darrell, you're like basically a beast. Like, you don't tire. We need you to do this, where you're going to lead the sled dog patrol in temperatures down to minus 50 degrees Celsius through deep snow. And on top of it, you don't get to wear ordinary snowshoes because that'll distribute your weight too evenly. We need you to actually sink down deeper into the snow, up to your knees or more, to actually break that trail. Darrell's just like, yeah, sure. He does it like the whole thing's like a vacation for him. And the Mounties are blown away. They're like, this guy's ability is uncanny. They hire him again north of the Arctic to lead the.
So we just do that. That trip is Dawson City to Fort McPherson, right?
That's one of the ones. But then if you recall, he also gets hired to lead them to Herschel Island on the Beaufort Sea. Lead one other Mountie on foot. The Mountie will travel by dog sled, but you travel on foot for hundreds of miles. Out onto the frozen Arctic Ocean, where the only company is polar bears, and it's in the winter north of the Arctic Circle, so there's no sunrise. Navigate in the dark, lead these Mounties.
No windbreak,
and Darrell does this without a misstep. He successfully leads every single expedition. There's no loss of life. They never get turned around. Everything goes like ahead of schedule. And the Mounties want more of him, but he's like, no, it's not for me. I don't really want to work with the Mounties. So he just disappears. He says, I'm going off into the true wilderness and I'm going to go explore, essentially for no other reason than my own curiosity. He has friends. For a wanderer, this is one of the things I had to uncover, is that I would constantly be going down what I call rabbit holes, where I'd be like, okay, the trail's gone cold, the letter trail, the paper trail that I'm trying to follow, but I know that there was this whaling captain on the Beaufort Sea in that same year, 1908. And that whaling captain would have kept a logbook. Where is that logbook today? And then I go and find, it's in an archive in New England. They've got it. Maybe I can reach out to the archivist there and say, I'm interested in not so much your whaling captain, but somebody else. Would you be so kind as to photocopy his logbook so I can read it? And sometimes it would lead to nothing, but other times in the middle of this logbook from like 1908 on the Beaufort Sea, I'd find a whaling captain who mentions this lone wanderer who showed up at his ship. And of course, it turns out to be Hubert Darrell. And I would keep doing this, digging through different sources, missionaries' journals and diaries of Mounties, fur trappers, everything I could. And one thing that I found is that Darrell at the time was famous in the North. Nobody knew him outside the North, but he was famous, and everyone seemed to like him. He had an easygoing sort of personality. He was very low key, so he could get along with anyone. even though he was a lone wolf, he was held in really high regard. So everyone was constantly trying to get him to be part of their expedition or lead us, but he didn't always want to do it. He'd turn down offers. He never had any money. He died with like virtually not a cent to his name.
Yeah,
And
$13 or something like that.
he came north hoping to find gold to pay off his farm's debts, him and his brother, his older brother's farm in Manitoba. Never happened. And he would often turn down very well-paying offers just because he thought, I don't like the guy's personality, or I think the expedition plan is not practical or feasible. But when he
Let's talk about Albert Harrison in that context too, because every good mystery needs like a nemesis character. And
I know. The whole thing seems like, a Hollywood movie. Yeah, there's another British aristocrat by the name of Alfred Harrison, and he tries to become a second Hanbury, but he has none of Hanbury's brains or ability. He's a member of the Royal Geographical Society. He's very wealthy. He lives in England, but he ends up coming to Canada, and he wants to lead an expedition of his own. And it sounds completely quixotic. His expedition idea is to discover a new continent, which he thinks is somewhere out there in the Arctic Ocean. It's not quite as absurd as it sounds today. Of course, at that time, before the invention of aircraft, much of the Arctic was totally unknown. Eventually, you go far enough north in the Arctic and you get into the truly uninhabited places where there's not even Inuit. And the Arctic Ocean is just frozen ice. It's not like Antarctica. There's no underlying landmass. So a lot of people speculated at that time, there's got to be land out there somewhere, right? If you keep going north across the Beaufort Sea, somewhere in that ocean, there must be some sort of unknown continent. And Alfred Harrison, it was his ambition to discover it, but he knew that he didn't have the practical experience to actually mount an Arctic expedition. But he heard, one way or another, through the grapevine of the fur trade, about Hubert Darrell. So he ended up corresponding with Hubert Darrell and saying, I want to hire you to lead me, to guide me on this expedition. Darrell, he has some misgivings about Harrison, but ultimately he agrees. And they end up going from Edmonton, which Edmonton at that time is not the provincial capital. It's just a little fur trading, farming community. And from there, they travel by boat all the way north to Great Slave Lake. They go down the Mackenzie River, hoping to go out into the Beaufort Sea. And eventually, when it gets to winter, they'll travel by dog sled. But long before they get there, when they're going down the Mackenzie River, Darrell realizes Harrison is just completely incompetent, and this is just a ludicrous idea that's not going to work. So he ends up quitting the expedition. And Darrell is, for a low-key guy, he's a man of honor. So he says to Harrison, I'm going to return all the wages you paid me. Even the 4 months I spent getting you this far, I'll return every wage, every penny back to you, even though Darrell has no money and Harrison's very wealthy. But this isn't good enough for Harrison. And Harrison does something very foolish. In a fit of passion, he challenges Darrell to a fight. And they end up fighting on the banks of the Mackenzie River, right on the Arctic Circle there. And it goes about as how you would expect it would go. Darrell quickly knocks Harrison out. And that should have been the end of the matter, but for Harrison, it isn't. He actually goes to the Mounties in Fort McPherson and wants Darrell to be arrested. Arrest this man. He broke his contract, he betrayed me, and he fought me. And the Mounties, I guess they formed a pretty quick assessment of Harrison's personality, his fiery temper. So they actually have a little inquiry where they cross-examine both of them to get to the bottom of matters. And the long and the short of it is they decide that there's no charges to be laid against Darrell, which enrages Harrison, and he promises, I have powerful friends back in England. I'll have all your badges, kind of thing. But yeah, and the irony is that this leaves Darrell stranded, penniless, alone in the Arctic without so much as a dog for a companion. But it sets the stage for his greatest and most legendary feats because he's desperate and he needs money to help his brother, who he was always nagging on his heart that his brother is still back on the farm, struggling to make ends meet. So it's that moment that leads to him doing the journey to save the whalers, because they know the whalers are trapped out there on the ice, that they're running desperately low on food, and no one else is going to volunteer to try to carry word of their situation to the outside world. But Darrell says, I'll do it. So this is what you got to do. You got to carry these dispatches over the Richardson Mountains in the dead of winter. It's going to be down to -50. There'll only be about an hour of daylight, and you'll have to travel in darkness for hundreds of miles without a trail, over the border into Alaska, and then go south to Fort Yukon. And from there, the dispatches have to get to Eagle, to the nearest telegram station. And Darrell says, okay. And when he walks out of Fort McPherson on snowshoes in the winter, everyone there, the fur trappers, the Mounties, all the locals think, well, It is a dead man walking. We'll never see or hear of that guy again. But they're astonished when months later he comes back and he's succeeded. And that's really the beginning of his legend in the North.
And Harrison goes on to really badmouth him in his book, and
Yeah,
goes on to make a whole bunch of like extraordinary claims that are patently false. And this really goads him on too, doesn't it, Darrell?
yeah, I mean, it sounds bizarre in the context of 2025, but Harrison, when he eventually gets back to civilization a couple of years later, he writes a book called In Search of a Polar Continent. That's the thesis, that he's seeking this polar continent. And in the book, he says he slanders Darrell. He says Darrell's incompetent, doesn't know what he's doing, all this stuff. Nobody believes it, of course, in the North. And Darrell's obviously, Darrell's family, when they see the book, they're mortified. They're like, oh my goodness, Harrison, this aristocrat, said all these bad things about you. And they say, what can we do? And Darrell just basically shrugs and says, I don't care. He can say what he wants about me. It doesn't bother me on a personal level. The only thing that irks me, he says, is that Harrison's maps are fraudulent. His maps of the Mackenzie Delta, the Husky Lakes, are not accurate. They're imaginary. And yet, in the eyes of the world, in the Royal Geographical Society and everyone else, they think Harrison's maps are accurate. And actually, that is partly what makes Darrell come up with his fateful decision to go to those areas and map them, just so that they're accurately mapped and that he can prove that Harrison's maps were just basically fantasy hallucinations. He doesn't really care about the personal insults, but he says, no, claiming that you mapped something you didn't, that's a bridge too far. And he goes there to map them. And that's when he ultimately vanishes.
And so you, I mean, as you've mentioned, you go look for him, and that's the canoeing portion of this, your travels up there. So the Anderson River and the Smoke River, neither of which are rivers I really knew anything about. And I've traveled a little bit up that area, but so what were those adventures like for you to actually be on the ground?
Right. I mean, it's one thing to read through old journals and letters and look at old water-stained black and white photographs, but I felt I can't really tell his story. I have to basically retrace his footsteps, put myself in his boots and do the things he did, go to where he went. So it was pretty much a given from the beginning when I started writing this book that I got no choice. I got to actually go to some very remote rivers, some very remote locations in the Arctic, and spend weeks or months retracing his steps if I'm going to truly do justice to his story and try to describe it. In the Arctic, I mean, because it's cold, even with climate change, it's cold enough that the preservation is really good. It's amazing when you're hundreds of kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. It's like a time capsule. A campfire somebody had over 100 years ago, the ashes can still be there. A stump somebody cut 100 years ago in more southern latitudes would long since rot away. But north of the Arctic Circle up there, that stump can still be sitting there. So I went to go find his campsites, retrace his route, and that was a quest in itself. But I did that to try to, accurately reconstruct his final movements, to put all the pieces of the puzzle together and try to come up with an explanation of what ultimately happened to him, which you've read the book, so you know what that is. I don't want to give any spoilers away, but it's pretty dramatic. And when you see all the pieces of the puzzles put together, all the different types of evidence I dig up, there is pretty much, I think, a pretty firm conclusion where it all points to. A pretty drastic end to the saga of Hubert Darrell.
Just how remote is that area?
So that area where he disappeared, both 115 years ago in 1910 and today, is still very remote. There's no roads within anywhere with hundreds of kilometers of that area. And again, when I started, I only had a very rough ballpark figure of the area where he vanished. We're talking an area of hundreds of kilometers. And I know that he was on the Anderson River. The Anderson River is not a well-known river. It's very remote. There's no road access anywhere near there, but that flows into the Beaufort Sea. This is a couple hundred kilometers east of the Mackenzie River. And I knew that Darrell had apparently built a cabin there, and I talk all about this in the book, and that in the winter, or early winter, November, he had left to rendezvous with a couple of his best friends, actually a French-Canadian couple, the Jacots, and he was supposed to rendezvous with them at an agreed-upon point where they had been earlier in the summer. And their account, the Jacots, turned out to be a really important piece of the puzzle for me to track down and find their account. So that was somewhere on the Husky Lakes, which are, despite the name lakes, are actually connected to the Beaufort Sea. There's salt water and they're tidal. If you look at them on a map or a satellite image, I mean, it looks like a labyrinth, all these different passageways. Darrell was supposed to rendezvous on a point there, and he had to cover a considerable amount of distance, almost 200 kilometers on foot to get there. So somewhere in that area was kind of my search area. that's where he disappeared. And I kept trying to uncover other archival clues, any hints to narrow the search area down. And eventually I did have a kind of epiphany where I had a sort of eureka moment involving the tree line and stuff to narrow it down. And it took multiple attempts. I had to keep going back and keep searching to narrow it down and try to figure out where's his final campsite, where did
Yeah.
he disappear? And I think eventually I did succeed, which is all part of the story in the book.
We won't spoil that for sure. If there's ever going to be a Law and Order Northwest Territories, I want there to be a Bishop Springer character, because Bishop Springer's forensics. So he's obviously a missionary up there, and shortly after Darrell disappears, he digs into it, and you do some digging of your own and find his account, which was amazing read, like just unbelievable.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
like great journalism, basically, or great investigative journalism, or
Yeah, and whenever I write a book, like A History of Canada in 10 Maps or this one, Vanished Beyond the Map, I try to let the people from the time speak in their own words as much as possible. So I always
Mhm.
reproduce where I can their original diaries and their letters and their journals so that the reader can read exactly what they were thinking at the time, what were they saying, give you a flavor of what they really believed. And when I was trying to piece together his disappearance, one of the things was nobody ever searched for him. It wasn't like Franklin when Franklin disappeared and they launched numerous expeditions to find out what happened to Franklin. When Darrell disappeared because he was one man in an ultra remote location, no rescue party was ever sent. And that was also partly because they didn't really realize he was actually missing for quite some time. Everyone had such respect for his abilities that they thought it's not uncommon for him to disappear for a year at a time only to turn up later at some far-flung trade post. So it took a while before they actually realized he's vanished. And by that point, the trail had gone cold. But nonetheless, some clues, some evidence is eventually uncovered. Some Inuit trappers actually do find what seems to be the remains of his sled and some other articles of his gear, which is taken to the Mounties. And the Mounties are on the fence about trying to mount an expedition, but they don't because they're like, he was our own guide. This isn't going to work. And it's not really a priority. It seems strange to us. But the reality is, and I get into this in the book, people disappeared all the time in the wild. It was just par for the course in an era before snowmobiles, before helicopters, before satellite communications. And many of the people in Darrell's own social network, some of his close friends, they themselves end up disappearing or drowning in the wilderness because hazards were a fact of life in that era. It was an era of incredible hardship. So nothing is ever really done, but there are these breadcrumbs, so to speak, that are left behind. And it's those breadcrumbs that 100+ years later I tried to follow to figure out. One of the juiciest breadcrumbs is left by, as you said, a missionary by the name of Isaac Stringer, Bishop Stringer. He became a bishop in the Anglican Church. And Stringer is an interesting character in his own right. He spends decades living in the North, in the Yukon, and in the Northwest Territories, traveling the old-fashioned way. And he becomes intrigued by the mystery of Darrell's disappearance. And he's on the ground, he's on the Beaufort Sea. So he tries to take his detailed notes about whatever he can find from the Inuit trappers, and he can speak the language, so he's recording everything as meticulously as possible and trying to figure out what happened to Darrell. And the mystery thickens when they actually end up discovering, about a year after Darrell has vanished, a note from Darrell that's carved into a tree on the banks of the Anderson River. And Stringer's, oh my goodness. So it's very remote and it takes months for them to even get back to the tree, but they transcribe it. And at first there's confusion over what does it actually say. It's faded, but there's no doubt that it's a note from Hubert Darrell. And it seems to be saying, I was heading this way east. And this is part of the mystery. And it ends up being reported at the time. It gets into the newspapers, messaged from the Lost Explorer. When I read all this, I thought, this is incredible. It seems like something out of a Hollywood movie. There's no way this actually happened, that they find messages from him a year after his disappearance. It can't be real. It's like Indiana Jones type stuff. But it turns out it was all true. There was confusion over what the message actually said. And Stringer goes to great lengths to actually find an accurate transcription, which I think he does, and he puts it together and says, oh no, that wasn't really a 1, that was supposed to be an I. This is what he was doing. And that's obviously an important clue in unraveling the whole mystery of the whole thing about his disappearance. And again, in the book, I explain different theories they had at the time, what happened to him. Could it have been this? Could it have been that? To try to narrow it down to the most likely explanation based on all of the available evidence, which is, of course, in the book.
yes, and encourage people to pick up the book for sure. I want to add another thing about the book too, and we were talking about maps. there's great maps in this book all the way through it. And I think a family connection to those maps for you.
Yeah, making maps is always a challenge for a book. And I try to explain this to people because I love maps. I love making maps. These are books that people read primarily for entertainment, right? They're fun to read because they're small. They're just like this. So reproducing accurate maps is difficult because if you look at a topographic map, like a 1/50,000 scale, it's huge, right? And if you try to shrink that down to print it on 8 by 11-inch paper, all the detail is lost. And that's something I've always struggled with my books. It'd be like, it'd be wonderful to print a giant atlas, but printing atlases, as you know, is very expensive and the market is often very small for them. But we tried to make better maps for this book. There's lots of maps in there showing the tree line and key points of the mystery.
Yeah.
My wife drew the maps, and so did my sister-in-law. And we do have a color map in the book. And there's also a lot of color photographs as well as black and white photographs produced in the book. I think we have around 60 total in the book. It hasn't. I mean, as we're talking right now, I haven't seen. This is just a mock-up. This isn't the real thing. The real thing is coming out in still a little month away. So I haven't actually seen what it's going to look like. But yeah, it's going to have color photos in it and the maps as well to try to shed light on the whole mystery of Darrell.
Why did you feel at this time it was important to tell his story? What was it that you felt he had to say to us in this day and age?
Well, that partly I don't want to get too philosophical.
Please do, though.
At the end of the day,
it's a podcast. We've got time.
Yeah, but you've read my book, so there's actually quite a bit of humor in it as well, right? I always throw in some humor and try to be lighthearted. I try not to take my own work too seriously. At the end of the day, I realize I'm mostly writing to entertain people, right? You pick up this book and it'll make you want to go out on an adventure, climb that mountain, paddle that river, find what's over the next hill or around the next bend in the river. And that's partly of it. It's just the adventure of it all. But I felt we've had so many books on Franklin. I'm not saying anything bad about those books. Obviously, I know quite a few authors of those books, and they're great. But I was like, the world doesn't need another book on a lost explorer like Franklin or Percy Fawcett, who disappeared in the Amazon, and they ended up making a big movie about him a few years ago. But there's been so many books on other famous lost explorers. And I'm like, it's extraordinary that Darrell is completely a blank. No one knows anything about him. He's never had a book on him. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. He's never had a documentary. So I said, this is actually a subject that deserves to be more widely known. And as I'm sure, David, as a journalist, you can relate to that, right? That's what journalists do. You're like, hey, this is a story that hasn't been reported on. I need to get that out there. Admittedly, you guys try to do breaking news, like something that's just happening, big breaking news. And this is more than 100 years ago, but that's why it's a book and not a breaking news story. It's still a fascinating story and one that I thought needs to be more widely told. All my books, they do have a special sort of epilogue or afterword in which I make a plea for conservation. And in my different books, I give different reasons for why we should do a much better job than we're doing, preserving the planet's wild places. And even in this book, which is about a lost explorer, I ultimately give a reason taken from the life of Darrell that I think if Darrell was here today, he would tell us the really elusive thing he hunted out there in the wild wasn't gold. It was the wild itself. And this is an understated theme, never explicitly articulated, but it's there. It's running throughout the book. The call of the wild, what that is, and why does it haunt lonely souls? What is it about the wilderness? What makes it special? Why did Darrell turn his back on civilization in an era when people were mostly doing the opposite? People were leaving the countryside and moving into the booming cities of the industrial age and all the new opportunities created by the fabulous inventions, Thomas Edison, light, the first cars, the first motion pictures, all these things are being invented. And Darrell turns his back on all of it in favor of the hardest, most difficult life imaginable as a solitary wanderer in the Arctic. And what is it about that's special? And maybe what do we risk losing if we basically eliminate those wild places? We tend to take it for granted that we'll always have a vast, untamed north, but I don't think that it's really the case. If we continue down the path we're doing, it's kind of like death by 1,000 cuts. We keep building more roads and highways and opening up more mines. Eventually, we'll get to a place where there's really no real wild left, and I think that we would all be the poorer for it, even if we never go there. There's just something about it, I think, that does the soul good to know that there's still these vast wild places just over the horizon. So that's part of the book as well. But I just said I didn't want to get too philosophical, and then you forced me into it. So there you go.
No, but it's beautiful, and that does definitely run through it. And I think what I loved about it too, and I have my own family history, especially in the Western Arctic, and Charles Campsell, who was an explorer. They were almost born in the same year.
They almost cross paths. Campbell is mentioned in a couple of Darrell's letters. It's just mentioned in briefing in the book. I don't know if you remember,
Yeah.
but he's on Great Slave Lake, and he hopes that Campbell or one of the other leaders of an expedition might want to recruit him. But at that time, he's still very young. He's still unknown, and they're like, he's a solitary wanderer. Anyway, who is this guy,
Yeah.
right? We're more geologists, right?
Exactly. He's trying to join the Geological Survey.
Right. He hears about Campbell coming north, and he wants to. He's very shy, right? He's a shy kind of guy, but he hopes that they'll somehow recruit him. But they, by the time they get to Great Slave Lake, they already have a full complement of men, and they're like, we're not looking to hire some unknown wanderer who's in his early 20s.
Exactly. That trip was Charles Campbell's kind of breakout. Like he got
Right.
onto that expedition, and that was the thing. So I found it fascinating that they were both jockeying to get on there. And the other end of that is my cousin Terry Campbell's grandfather was Sam Carter, who was one of the Lost Patrol, the men in the Lost Patrol. He was actually the special constable that replaced Darrell. Darrell was meant to lead that patrol in
Yeah.
Yeah, but he disappeared, so they had to bring in Sam Carter, and that obviously it was like this huge story, and poor constable died in the bush. And
That's incredible. That's an incredible family history. I mean,
yeah,
it's amazing.
yeah, no, and what's the beauty of, and I think Charles Campbell wrote a memoir, and a part of why he wrote that memoir, and he told my mother this, was because he knew he grew up in an era that was ending or had
Right,
ended.
yeah.
And basically the airplane changed the North dramatically.
Definitely, yeah.
And the beauty of what you capture, I think, is that exactly that era too. I guess I just want to say thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, no, it's a great read, and like I say, I just plowed through it with absolute pleasure, and it's a great mystery. You can tell you've spent time researching the subject. You can tell you spent time on the ground. It all comes through on the page, and it's always a pleasure to have you here, Adam.
Anytime. Thanks for having me back on the podcast.
Thanks to Adam for another amazing piece of storytelling. And hey, stick around for a few minutes longer and my conversation with my twin nephews, Callum and Keenan McGuffin. Where are you right now, and can you describe the last couple of days and what's been going on up there?
Right now, we're anchored in Cambridge Bay. Last couple of days have been pretty rough. We've been waiting out a big storm on the southeast side of Victoria Island. We probably had a max wind speed of 60 knots.
That's pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
And are you seeing a lot of sea ice up there? I mean, what's it like being in a storm in those kinds of conditions?
So for us, in that particular storm, we were quite lucky in that there's no sea ice around us. A lot of the boats that are farther ahead of us had to be out on the bow all night with ice poles, pushing the ice away from them. So that was nice for us. We found a very sheltered bay. It was about 10 feet deep, and we anchored in there with 100 feet of chain out. So we had good holding.
Leaving Halifax, can you just tell us a bit about the route you took and what kind of adventures you had along there? Where was the first stop after Halifax?
So we went from Halifax, we cruised up the coast, and then in Newfoundland, we had some serious engine trouble. So we spent a lot longer there than we intended to. So that's why we're behind the boats right now. And then we went from there up the coast of Labrador to Hawks Harbor, which is an old abandoned whaling station. And then we cut straight across to Greenland, which was 600 nautical miles crossing. So I think that took us about 10 days.
What was that crossing like?
The first, 6 days of it were dead calm with very little ice. And then when we got inside of the coast of Greenland, the wind picked up to about 25 to 30 knots from the north. So one day we made, I think, 20 miles progress towards our destination just because the waves were so steep, forcing us back. It was, for the most part, it was a really good crossing, really easy crossing until the last couple of days.
You guys have a great Instagram going, and I saw there's some pictures there. You saw some muskox, I think.
Yeah, so that was our next stop. That was in Disco Bay. We were hiking right along the side of the ice fjord, and I was just coming up over a hill, and I saw this big hairy shape 30 feet in front of me. So I backed down, back over the hill, and then we went around and looked at them from a different angle.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends who've They've spent time in the Arctic, and they say other than polar bears, the muskox are the things that terrify them the most. So yeah, backing away was the right thing, I think.
Yeah, that's what everyone in Greenland told us is in Greenland anyway, they're almost more of a risk than polar bears are.
And polar bears, I think, have you seen some en route?
Yeah, we've seen 6 now. Our first encounter was somewhat exciting. We were on Baffin Island, anchored there, and we went ashore, hiked in about a kilometer from the dinghy, and I just looked up and saw this white shape coming down the creek, and they moved fast. So it was probably 500 meters from us, and we just turned around and headed back to the dinghy, and it was all fine, but it definitely gets your heart pumping.
Yeah, they're massive and yeah, kind of indestructible. So yeah, it must be incredible. I've never seen one in the wild, so it must be incredible.
They're fun when they're not too close to you.
Yeah, exactly.
We had another encounter on King William Island, and it was super foggy, and we were hiking inshore, and then the fog came in, and we stumbled upon 2 polar bears about 350 meters away. So we turned around and started walking the other way. And then I looked up and there was another 2 polar bears. This time, I think they were 75 meters from us. We backed away again and got over a crest and then turned around, headed in the other direction.
Wow. Yeah, I don't need coffee on a day like that, do you? That's got to be an adrenaline rush. And what about marine life? What kind of, are you seeing whales? What are you seeing?
Coming up the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador, we saw tons of whales. We'd easily see 10 whales in a day. But now, since we've got up into the Arctic, we haven't actually seen any. We've seen a couple seals, but very little marine wildlife.
Have you had time to spend any time in communities along the way?
The only communities we've stopped in Pond Inlet, and then we stopped here, and those are the only 2 communities we've stopped in so far. We've been on a pretty tight timeline because of our engine troubles in Newfoundland, so we're about 2 weeks behind where we want to be.
It is September now. What are the temperatures like up there right now?
Currently, it's about 7 degrees. Last night, it went down to -2. And we've had a couple, it's been snowing the last couple of days.
So you're heading into it. What do you think your rough timeline is? You're heading back to Salt Spring?
We're hoping to get to Salt Spring around the middle of November. It'll be cold the whole way down.
Will be. It's the opposite of your departure, right? Because I think you headed to Hawaii first. So it's a nice sort of odd bookend, I guess. We were messaging each other. You mentioned you'd just been through that area where the Franklin expedition met its watery, icy end. And what was it like? I'm sure you guys, I see you've got the Michael Palin book up behind you there. What was it like, having read about that, what's it like sailing through those waters?
It was kind of surreal to be see the beach where he had landed and that whole area where they had been almost 200 years ago. And we weren't really looking for anything from when he was there. But when we were walking around, we found a cairn. We believe it was the cairn that was left to mark the grave of one of the Franklin people by Schwatka. Yeah, Schwatka left it there.
Yes, grim reminders makes you appreciate the world that you're sailing through too, what the possibilities are. And yeah. Did you, just curious, you're in a 30-foot sailboat. Did you have to do any work on it to prep it for heading into icy waters, or how does that work?
Really we didn't do a ton. It's not insulated, so it gets pretty cold in here. But we did add a diesel heater, and we built a little heater that runs off to the coolant on our engine. And then other than that, we drastically increased our fuel capacity, and we got some ice poles. That's really the extent of our changes to the boat for this trip. The boat was built in 1970, so the fiberglass is about an inch thick. So we can run it. We've ran it aground in Fiji, and we've run it into ice, and it's solid.
Okay. Don't test it too much. I'm just curious about day-to-day stuff. What's a meal look like out there for you guys? And who's the better cook?
With our meals, it's hard to tell. For breakfast, we usually have oats. And then we usually have one other meal, and that's either instant noodles or canned beans. And that's about the extent of our diet. We've got 300 cans on board.
What's been a highlight, would you say, of this section of your voyage so far?
I would say definitely Stamford Fjord on Baffin Island. We were anchored under 1,300-meter cliff, and it's just like all around you is these vertical rock walls. And we're actually able to tie up to one of the cliffs like a dock. Someone had put climbing pins in there. And then there's glaciers flowing down into the water all around you. Like, you could look around and probably see 6 different glaciers there.
People talk about the silence up where you guys are right now. What is that?
I mean, it's very similar to what you'd experience in the doldrums or in a lot of places we've been so far. Yeah, it's definitely, there's not much human-made noise pollution around. It's quite loud when you start going through the ice in this boat. It's not a nice sound at all.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. Fingers crossed as you could do it, I'm sure. Yeah. And if people want to follow you, what's the best way to trail along on your adventures with you?
the best way would be through our social media. So that's on Instagram and Facebook, McGuffin Brothers Adventures. And we have a website that we try and keep up to date. That's also McGuffinBrothersAdventures.com.
I'll keep following your adventures, and congratulations to the two of you. It's been what an incredible voyage, and I wish you all the best as you continue back home to Salt Spring.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
The last time I checked in on them online, they were in the Northwest Territories, making good time, hopefully staying ahead of the ice. Definitely check out their Instagram and Facebook pages for amazing videos and photography about their trip around the world. And don't forget, if you like this episode or this podcast, please share a link with family and friends. It's simply the best way for these interviews to reach a wider audience. Give us a rating and review where you listen, and also subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Until next time, when we'll explore again, I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people.
We left Simpson about June 10th with the fur brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
And we flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
Oh, I guess 160 dives or so. There are shrimp, fish swimming around outside. It's just fabulous here.
Well, I'm a first for Canada.